There exists in the British Museum a manuscript so fragile that scholars may only examine it under strictly controlled conditions. It sits in a climate-controlled vault, its pages darkened by centuries, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. This manuscript, catalogued as Cotton Vitellius A.15, contains one of the earliest written versions of the Beowulf epic. But tucked away in the margins in a different hand, added perhaps a century after the main text, is a single curious notation: Rex Arthurus Unfeut? King Arthur. Did he exist? That question, scrawled by an anonymous medieval monk in the margins of another hero's story, is perhaps the perfect summary of our entire journey tonight. Welcome. I'm grateful you're here, settling in for this exploration through the mists of Britain's past. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video if you find value in it, and subscribe if these late-night historical journeys speak to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. There's something quietly powerful about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet gathered here in the darkness, chasing the same ghost. Tonight we're not searching for easy answers. We're searching for something more valuable: understanding. Understanding of how a man becomes a myth, how a myth becomes a necessity, and how that necessity shapes the soul of a civilization for 1500 years. Part 1. The Silence. Let me begin with what should trouble us most. There is a period in British history, roughly spanning the years 400 to 600 CE, that historians call Sub-Roman Britain. It's the twilight between the end of Roman administration and the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that would eventually become England. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most important periods in British history. It's the moment when the entire ethnic, linguistic, and cultural identity of the island was being rewritten. And we know almost nothing about it. Imagine trying to understand American history without any documents from the Revolutionary War period. No letters from Washington, no Declaration of Independence, no newspapers, no journals. Just a handful of third-hand accounts written generations later by people with their own agendas. That's what we're dealing with when we try to find the historical Arthur. The silence is profound. It's not just that we lack evidence for Arthur specifically. We lack evidence for almost everything. This isn't because the people of that time were illiterate or primitive. It's because their world was collapsing. Picture Britain in the year 410 CE. For nearly 4 centuries, it had been a Roman province, and not just conquered territory but genuinely Roman. The transformation had been deep, pervasive, almost total. There were cities with forums and temples, amphitheaters where crowds gathered to watch gladiatorial games, bathhouses with sophisticated heating systems, villas with heated floors and mosaic tiles depicting scenes from Ovid and Virgil. There was a road network that connected the entire island, straight Roman roads that even today form the backbone of Britain's transport system. There was a monetary economy with standardized coinage, professional administrators who kept meticulous records, and most importantly, a literate bureaucratic class that recorded everything. The level of Romanization in Britain was remarkable. By the late 4th century, the British elite spoke Latin as their primary language. They wore togas, read classical literature, and sent their sons to be educated in Gaul or even Rome itself. Towns like Londinium, London, Eboracum, York, and Corinium, Cirencesta, had populations in the tens of thousands. They had running water, paved streets, public buildings that would have looked at home in any Mediterranean city. The countryside was dotted with villas, not the fortified castles of later centuries, but elegant country houses with painted walls, mosaic floors, and formal gardens. These were the homes of the Romano-British aristocracy, men who made their fortunes in the grain trade, in pottery production, and iron working. They lived lives of considerable luxury, dining on imported wines and olive oil, wearing jewelry that showed exquisite craftsmanship. This was the Britain that had existed for 400 years. 4 centuries is a long time, longer than the United States has existed, longer than the time between Shakespeare and our present day. Multiple generations of Britons had known nothing but Roman civilization. It must have seemed eternal, unchangeable, as permanent as the stone roads and the city walls. And then it ended. Not slowly, not gracefully, but with terrifying speed. In a series of desperate letters written between 408 and 410, the Emperor Honorius essentially told the Britons they were on their own. The legions were needed elsewhere. Rome itself was being sacked by Visigoths under Alaric. The empire was hemorrhaging territory on every frontier. Britain, that remote island at the very edge of the known world, was expendable. Try to imagine what this meant to the Romano-British elite. For 400 years, their entire identity had been built on being part of Rome, part of the greatest civilization the world had ever known. And now, in the span of a few years, they were cut loose. No more legions to defend the frontiers. No more imperial administrators. No more connection to the vast trade network that had supplied their luxuries. They were on their own. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares, a collapse so complete and so swift that it's hard to find parallels in history. The infrastructure that had taken 4 centuries to build began to crumble within a generation. The roads, without constant maintenance, became overgrown and waterlogged. The cities, which had depended on a complex economic system to feed and supply them, began to empty out. Archaeological evidence shows that by 450, many British towns had been largely abandoned. People simply walked away from the public buildings, the forums, the bathhouses. They couldn't maintain them, couldn't afford to live in them. The villa economy collapsed. Without the Roman military to buy their grain, without the trade network to export their goods, the villa owners found themselves with estates they couldn't defend and couldn't profit from. Many villas show evidence of violence: burned thatch, scattered coins suggesting hasty flight. Others were simply abandoned, left to slowly decay. By 500, most of the great villas were ruins. The money economy disappeared almost overnight. Coin hoards buried around 410 to 420 show people desperately trying to preserve their wealth. But no new coins were minted, and the old ones quickly lost their meaning. Within a generation, Britain had returned to a barter economy. The sophisticated financial system that had lubricated the entire Romano-British world simply ceased to exist. Literacy plummeted. The schools closed. The bureaucratic class, with no bureaucracy to administer, either fled to Gaul or adapted to the new reality of becoming warlords. The art of writing didn't disappear completely, the church preserved it, but it became increasingly rare. The meticulous record-keeping of the Roman era was replaced by silence. And into this chaos came the raids. From across the North Sea, Saxon war bands began probing the eastern coasts. These weren't organized invasions at first. They were opportunistic raids, small groups of warriors in shallow draft boats, landing on undefended beaches, grabbing what they could and escaping before any organized resistance could form. The Saxons had been raiding Britain for decades. The Saxon shore forts that lined the eastern and southern coasts had been built specifically to defend against them. But those forts had been garrisoned by professional Roman soldiers, backed by the infrastructure and resources of the empire. Now they were manned by skeleton crews or abandoned entirely. The warning beacons that had once flashed news of raids along the coast went unlit. The naval patrols that had interdicted raiders at sea no longer sailed. For the Saxon raiders, it must have seemed like a miracle. The rich province they'd only been able to nibble at was suddenly defenseless. The raids became more frequent, more ambitious, more devastating. A monk named Gildas, writing about these events from the safety of a later generation, paints a picture of apocalyptic horror. He describes cities burning, their populations put to the sword. He describes refugees fleeing to the mountains of the west, carrying what possessions they could. He describes old men and pregnant women cut down without mercy, priests murdered at their altars, churches burned to the ground. His prose is purple, rhetorical, exaggerated. He was, after all, writing a sermon, not a history, and he had a theological point to make about God's judgment on sinful Britons. But the core truth is undeniable. This was a society in free fall, a civilization collapsing, a world ending. The Romano-British elites, the men who'd been educated in Latin, who'd read Virgil and Cicero, who'd administered the province's bureaucracy, who'd served as magistrates and decurions, who'd debated philosophy over dinner in their elegant villas. These men had to transform themselves or die. Many became warlords. They had to. In the absence of Roman legions, in the absence of any centralized authority, protection became intensely local and intensely personal. A man with armed followers could defend his territory, could extract tribute from those he protected, could establish himself as a lord in this new, brutal world. These weren't the disciplined formations of professional soldiers that Rome had fielded. These were war bands, groups of armed men bound by personal loyalty to a leader who could feed them, clothe them, give them plunder, and most importantly, give them a share of glory. The bond was personal and sacred. A warrior swore an oath to his lord. In exchange, the lord provided for his followers, protected their families, and led them to victory. This is the world that needed an Arthur. But here's what should haunt us, what should keep us awake even as this story tries to lull us towards sleep. In all the contemporary records from this period, and there are admittedly very few, his name doesn't appear. Not once. Not in any document we can reliably date to the 5th or even early 6th century. Not in any inscription carved in stone. Not in any letter, any chronicle, any administrative record. The man who supposedly saved Britain, who supposedly won the greatest victory of the age, who supposedly held back the tide of Saxon conquest for a generation. That man left no trace in the historical record of his own time. The silence where Arthur should be is deafening. Part 2, The First Witness. To understand the depth of this silence, we need to talk about Gildas, the only writer whose words bring us even close to Arthur's supposed time. Gildas is one of the most frustrating figures in all of British history. He wrote the only near-contemporary account we have of sub-Roman Britain, yet he seems to have deliberately withheld the very information we most desperately want to know. His work, De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, was written sometime around 540 CE, give or take a decade. The dating is imprecise, but most scholars place it in that range. That places Gildas roughly 40 to 50 years after the period when Arthur supposedly lived, when the great battles supposedly took place, when Britain supposedly hung in the balance. 40 to 50 years might sound like a long time, but in historical terms it's nothing. If Arthur fought his battles around 500 CE, Gildas would have been writing within living memory of those events. He would have been a young man hearing stories from old warriors who'd actually been there. He would have known people who knew Arthur personally if Arthur existed. The memory would have been fresh, immediate, still painful. Yet Gildas doesn't write history in any sense we'd recognize. He's not interested in giving us dates, names, battle sequences, political analysis. He's writing a Jeremiad, a fire and brimstone sermon aimed squarely at the British kings of his own day. His purpose isn't to inform, it's to shame, to condemn, to prophesy doom. The structure of his work reveals this. He begins with a highly selective and theologically driven overview of British history, designed to show God's pattern of judgment. Britain sins, Britain is punished. Britain repents, Britain is saved. Britain sins again, Britain is punished again. It's a cycle, and Gildas sees himself as the prophet calling his generation back from the brink. His prose is elaborate, rhetorical, soaked in biblical allusion. He's writing in Latin, very sophisticated Latin, showing that even in the middle of this dark age, there were still British clerics with impressive educations. But that education was now purely ecclesiastical. Gildas's models aren't the classical historians like Tacitus or Livy. His models are the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, men who spoke truth to power and called down God's wrath on sinful nations. This is important to understand because it shapes everything Gildas chooses to tell us and, more importantly, everything he chooses not to tell us. To make his theological point, Gildas does give us a rough outline of recent British history. He describes the Roman departure in apocalyptic terms. He describes the initial Saxon raids as divine punishment for British sin. He describes the desperate appeal to Rome for help, the famous groans of the Britons, which went unanswered because Rome had its own catastrophes to deal with. Then he describes a period of resistance led by a man he names, Ambrosius Aurelianus. This is the first name Gildas gives us for this entire period. Ambrosius Aurelianus. Gildas describes him in terms that drip with nostalgia and admiration. He calls him a gentleman, a term loaded with meaning. In Latin, vir modestus, a modest, proper, civilized man. Gildas tells us that Ambrosius's parents had worn the purple. That is, they had been of imperial rank, perhaps even members of the imperial family itself. This detail is tantalizing. It suggests that Ambrosius represented the last gasp of the old Romano-British aristocracy, the educated Latin-speaking elite who still remembered what it meant to be Roman. Perhaps his family had fled from Gaul as the empire collapsed there. Perhaps they were native British nobility who'd risen in Roman service. We don't know. Gildas doesn't tell us. What Gildas does tell us is that under Ambrosius's leadership, the Britons began to fight back. The tide turned. The Saxons, who had seemed unstoppable, encountered real resistance. The war, Gildas tells us, went back and forth with victories on both sides, sometimes the Britons, sometimes the enemy prevailing. This is the crucial passage. This is where Gildas describes a real, grinding war, not a single heroic campaign but a series of battles spread over years, perhaps decades. It's a war of attrition, of small gains and losses, of territory changing hands repeatedly. And it culminates in a massive battle at a place Gildas calls Mons Badonicus, Mount Badon. Gildas describes this battle in tantalizingly vague terms. He calls it an obsessio, a siege or a blockade. The wording suggests the Britons besieged the Saxons, not the other way around. It was a decisive British victory, crushing enough that it stopped the Saxon advance cold. More than that, it created peace. Real, lasting peace. Gildas, writing 44 years after the battle, he gives us the specific number, says that the peace won at Badon had held throughout his entire lifetime. Think about what that means. An entire generation of Britons had grown up without experiencing Saxon raids, without seeing their villages burned, without watching refugees stream westward. Badon had bought them that breathing space. This wasn't just some skirmish. This was the Gettysburg of sub-Roman Britain, the Waterloo, the Stalingrad, the battle that stopped an invasion and saved a civilization at least temporarily. And Gildas, in his description of this world historical battle, this generation-defining victory, doesn't mention a commander. He doesn't name a hero. He gives credit to God's providence and to the memory of Ambrosius Aurelianus as the one who started the resistance. But the actual victor at Badon? The general who commanded the British forces? The hero who led the charge? Silence. This is the empty space where Arthur should be. This is the hole in the historical record that has tortured scholars and inspired romancers for over 1,000 years. Later sources written 300 years after the fact, sources compiled from oral traditions and bardic poetry and probably a fair bit of creative imagination, will confidently place Arthur at Badon. They'll make it his crowning achievement, his finest hour, the battle that defines his entire career. But the man who was actually there, who lived through the aftermath, who benefited from the peace it created, who wrote about it in detail, never speaks his name. What? The theories are numerous and each one reveals something about how desperately we want Arthur to be real. Perhaps Arthur was there but wasn't the overall commander. Perhaps he was a subordinate, a cavalry commander, maybe, specializing in the mounted warfare that some scholars believe was the key to British success. Perhaps Ambrosius was the supreme commander, the strategic genius, while Arthur was the tactical specialist, the man who led the actual charge. If so, he might have been beneath Gildas's notice. Gildas is writing theology, not military history. He's interested in the broad sweep of God's judgment, not in cataloging individual warriors. Perhaps Arthur was a pagan or at least insufficiently Christian, and Gildas, a monk who saw everything through a religious lens, deliberately omitted him. This theory has some appeal. The name Arthur might derive from Artorius, a Roman family name, or from the Celtic Artos, meaning bear, possibly indicating connection to older, pre-Christian bear cults. If Arthur was associated with the old religions, if he sacrificed to the old gods before battle, if he represented a strain of British resistance that was more Celtic pagan than Romano-Christian, then Gildas might have considered him unworthy of mention despite his military success. Perhaps Arthur committed some sin or crime that made him, in Gildas's eyes, unworthy of honor. Perhaps he broke faith, perhaps he turned tyrant, perhaps he violated the church's authority. Gildas spends much of his work castigating the British kings of his own day for their sins, violence, adultery, injustice, pride. Perhaps Arthur, if he existed, fell into similar patterns, and Gildas refused to celebrate a sinner, no matter how militarily successful. Or perhaps, and we must face this possibility squarely, must let it sit with us in the darkness, Arthur wasn't there at all. Perhaps the great hero of Badon was Ambrosius. Perhaps there were multiple commanders whose names have been lost. Perhaps the victory was so collective, so much a product of the entire Romano-British resistance, that no single hero could be singled out. Perhaps it was a messy, chaotic battle won as much by Saxon overextension and supply problems as by British brilliance. And perhaps, in the centuries that followed, as the Saxons slowly conquered more and more territory, as the British were pushed back into Wales and Cornwall, as the memory of victory faded into the bitter reality of defeat, they needed a hero. They needed a name to attach to that one great shining moment when they won. They needed a story to tell themselves, a figure to embody their resistance, their defiance, their refusal to disappear. And so they found one. Or created one. Or remembered one whose actual role had been smaller but whose name, for some reason, the sound of it, the associations it carried, the poetry of it, survived when others didn't. The silence in Gildas isn't proof that Arthur didn't exist. But it's profound evidence that if he did exist, his role was very different from what the legends would later claim. It's evidence that the Arthur of history, if there was such a man, was already being transformed into the Arthur of legend within a century of his supposed death. And that transformation was only beginning. Part 3, The Whisper in the Hall. Before we jump ahead 3 centuries to the next written mentions of Arthur, we need to understand what was happening in the oral tradition during those silent years. Because while the monks weren't writing about him, the bards were singing about him. The Welsh bardic tradition is ancient, sophisticated, and maddeningly difficult to date. The poems that survive in manuscripts from the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries often contain material that is centuries older, Material passed down orally, generation after generation, modified by each performer, adapted to each audience, shaped by changing politics and changing fashions, and finally written down by Christian monks who didn't always understand the context of what they were copying. Imagine the process. A bard learns songs from his master. But he's not memorizing them word for word like a modern actor learning lines. He's learning patterns, structures, formulas. He's learning the shape of stories, the rhythm of heroic poetry, the stock phrases and epithets that can be recombined in new ways. He's learning, in essence, a language of heroic song. When he performs, he adapts. If he's in the court of a chieftain in Gwinnett, he emphasizes elements of the story that connect to Gwinnett. He might insert a reference to a local landmark, or suggest that one of the chieftain's ancestors rode with the heroes of old. The next month, performing for a different audience in a different kingdom, he adjusts again. The core story remains, the heroes, the battles, the tragedy, but the details shift. This isn't dishonesty. This is the nature of oral tradition. The songs are alive, responsive, constantly adapting to remain relevant to their audiences. They're not fixed texts but fluid performances. And somewhere in this process, Arthur's name began to attach itself to stories. Not just one story but many. Local battles, local heroes, local legends, they began to orbit around this central figure, this Arthur who was already becoming more than human. One of the earliest poems where we can catch a glimpse of this process is called Why Gododin. It's an elegy, a long lamentation for a warband from the kingdom of Gododin, roughly modern-day Edinburgh and southeastern Scotland, who rode south to fight the Angles at a place called Cattraeth, modern Catterick in North Yorkshire, around the year 600 CE. The poem is heartbreaking. It's structured as a series of stanzas, each one praising an individual warrior, describing his courage, his generosity, his prowess in battle, before ending with the terrible refrain, and he fell at Cattraeth. The entire expedition was a disaster. 300 warriors rode out, magnificently equipped, well-trained, confident. Only 3 returned. The poet, a bard named Aneurin, or so the tradition says, even this attribution is debated, seems to have been one of the survivors or at least someone with direct access to survivors. The details are too specific, too painful, too personal to be merely conventional. You can feel the weight of loss in every line. The warriors are described with intimate detail. This one was generous with his mead, never stinting his guests. That one was skilled with a spear, deadly in the charge. Another was young, barely bearded, on his first campaign. They were men, not just heroes. They had personalities, quirks, histories. And in one stanza, describing a warrior named Gwarder, the poet says, "He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur." Stop. Breathe. Think about what that single line reveals. This poem is dated to around 600 CE, possibly even a bit earlier. We're within 100 years of when Arthur supposedly lived. The Battle of Badon, if it happened around 500, would have been a century ago. Distant enough to be legendary, recent enough that some very old men might still have dim childhood memories of the aftermath, stories told by fathers and grandfathers who were there. And already Arthur is the gold standard. He's the benchmark of heroic excellence. The poet isn't saying he was almost as brave as Arthur, or he reminded us of the great Arthur. The comparison is negative. Gwarder was a mighty warrior who killed many enemies, but he was no Arthur. What does that tell us? It tells us that by 600 CE, at the very latest, Arthur was already legendary. His name was already the supreme example, the unreachable ideal. When a bard wanted to give his audience an instant understanding of just how extraordinary a warrior was, the highest praise, and the most honest praise, was to say he approached but didn't equal Arthur. This is not proof that Arthur existed as a historical person. But it's ironclad proof that he existed as a legendary hero within a century of when he supposedly lived. The myth was already old, already established, already central to British heroic culture. Think about what this means for the development of the legend. If Arthur was already the supreme hero by 600, the stories about him had been circulating for at least 2 or 3 generations, probably more. They had reached the point where everyone knew who Arthur was. His name needed no explanation, no introduction. He was part of the cultural furniture, as familiar as the mountains and rivers. The oral tradition was actively building the myth during those centuries of literary silence. The bards were singing of Arthur in halls from Cornwall to Scotland, from Wales to the British kingdoms that still survived in the north. Each performance added another detail, another battle, another heroic deed. Local traditions were drawn into the orbit of the legend. If there was an old hill fort in your territory and no one quite remembered who built it or why, well, Arthur must have built it. Arthur must have fought a battle there. This is how legends grow, like coral reefs, with each generation adding another layer. The original structure, if there was one, if there was a historical Arthur at the core, becomes increasingly buried, increasingly difficult to distinguish from all the accretions. But the process isn't random. The stories that survive, that get repeated, that become canonical, are the ones that serve a purpose. And in post-Roman Britain, the purpose was clear. These stories reminded the British of who they were, of a time when they won, of a hero who embodied their resistance against the invaders. Because by 600, the strategic situation had deteriorated badly. The peace won at Badon had lasted a generation, just as Gildas said. But it didn't last forever. The Saxons, having absorbed their defeat, began pushing west again. New war bands arrived from across the sea. The British kingdoms fought back, but they were increasingly on the defensive, increasingly fragmented, increasingly losing ground. In this context, Arthur wasn't just entertainment. He was necessity. He was proof that Britons could win, had won, would win again. He was the promise that however dark things got, a hero might arise. The oral tradition was keeping that promise alive, refining it, embellishing it, making it more vivid and more necessary with each telling. By the time monks finally began writing down these stories, 3 or 4 centuries after the supposed events, the historical truth, if it had ever been accessible, was long gone, buried under layers of poetry and politics and hope. Part 4. The List Maker. The silence finally breaks, or appears to break, around the year 830 with a strange, wonderful and deeply frustrating document called the Historia Brittonum, attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius. I say, attributed to, because the manuscript tradition is messy. Some versions name Nennius as the author, others present the work anonymously or credit it to other writers. The text itself seems to be a compilation, with different sections possibly having different authors. But for convenience and following scholarly tradition, we'll call our compiler Nennius. Nennius worked in an age when the old order was finally, irrevocably gone. By 830, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms dominated what we now call England. The British had been pushed into Wales, Cornwall, and the northern kingdom of Strathclyde. The language that would become English was spreading, replacing the British tongue. The cultural landscape was being rewritten. For a Welsh monk looking at this situation, the natural question was, how did we get here? How did Britain, which had been Roman and British for so long, become Saxon? What was the story of this transformation? But the sources available to answer these questions were fragmentary and unsatisfying. There were a few Latin texts like Gildas, but Gildas was frustratingly vague about specifics. There were genealogies preserved in the Welsh kingdoms, king lists that claimed to stretch back to the Roman period. There were the songs of the bards, the oral traditions, the stories everyone knew but that had never been written down. Nennius set himself a task, to gather everything. He would compile every scrap of information about British history he could find. He would preserve the king lists, the origin legends, the battle traditions, the saints' lives, the geographical lore. He would create a comprehensive chronicle of the British people, from their legendary Trojan origins to his own day. His methodology, by his own admission, was simple: I have made a heap of all I have found. This is sometimes translated more formally as, I have heaped together, but the colloquial version captures something essential about Nennius's approach. He wasn't primarily concerned with critical analysis, with weighing sources, with establishing what was probable versus what was legendary. He was concerned with preservation. The result is a text that modern historians find simultaneously invaluable and infuriating. It's a grab bag, a scrapbook, a compilation that leaps from topic to topic with little regard for chronology or coherence. There are origin myths claiming the British descend from Brutus, great-grandson of Aeneas of Troy. There are king lists and genealogies. There's a long section on the life of St. Patrick. There are geographical descriptions, including the famous catalogue of the wonders of Britain, natural phenomena and strange places. There are fragments of what seem to be older chronicles, copied without full understanding of their context. And in chapter 56 of this sprawling compilation, Nennius gives us the first actual biography, if we can call it that, of Arthur. It's brief. Fewer than 200 words in the original Latin. But it's electrifying because after 3 centuries of near total silence, here finally is someone willing to put specific, concrete claims about Arthur down in writing. Nennius writes, at that time the Saxons were growing strong in numbers and increasing in Britain. After Hengist died, Octa his son came down from the north of Britain to the kingdom of the Kentishmen, and from him are descended the kings of Kent. Then Arthur fought against them in those days together with the kings of the Britons, but he himself was the leader of battles. Let's parse this carefully because every phrase matters. At that time, places Arthur in the period after Hengist, the legendary first Saxon leader in Britain. According to Nennius's earlier sections, Hengist and his brother Horsa arrived in Britain in the mid-5th century, invited by a British king named Vortigern to serve as mercenaries. They turned on their employers, called in more Saxons, and began the conquest. So Arthur is being placed in the late 5th or early 6th century, exactly when the Battle of Badon is supposed to have occurred. The Saxons were growing strong in numbers, suggests a context of ongoing Saxon expansion, of settlements consolidating, of the pressure on British territory increasing. Arthur fought against them in those days together with the kings of the Britons, is crucial. Arthur is not called a king. He fights alongside the kings, but he's distinguished from them. He's something else. But he himself was the leader of battles. In Latin, dux bellorum. This is the key phrase. Dux means leader, commander, general. Bellorum, of battles. Arthur is the war leader, the military commander. This makes historical sense in a way that the later depiction of Arthur as king doesn't. In the fragmented post-Roman world there was no united British kingdom. There were multiple petty kingdoms, each with its own king, each ruling a territory that might be no larger than a single valley or a handful of villages. These kings were often at odds with each other. Old feuds, disputes over boundaries, competition for limited resources. But when an external threat appeared that was too large for any one kingdom to handle, they might temporarily set aside their differences. They might agree to a truce among themselves, pool their military forces, and appoint a single commander to lead their combined army. This was Arthur's role, if Nennius has it right, not a king with his own kingdom, but a general hired or chosen by the various British kings to coordinate their defense. A specialist in warfare, a man whose expertise was in commanding men, in strategy and tactics, in the brutal mechanics of survival. The Roman Empire had such positions: the Comes Britanniarum, Count of Britain, a late imperial military command, or the Dux Britanniarum, Duke of Britain, responsible for frontier defense. Perhaps Arthur, or whoever stood behind the Arthur legend, held some version of this title or aspired to recreate it. Perhaps he was educated enough or had access to people educated enough to understand how Roman military command had worked, and tried to implement it in the desperate circumstances of early 6th century Britain. The title Dux Bellorum suggests competence, professionalism, specialized knowledge. This isn't just a barbarian warlord leading raids. This is a commander, a strategist, someone who understood the larger picture. Then Nennius does something extraordinary and maddening in equal measure. He gives us a list of 12 battles Arthur fought. Here's the list in full. 1. The first battle was at the mouth of the river called Glane. 2-5. The second, third, fourth and fifth battles were on another river, called Douglas, which is in the region of Linuis. 6. The sixth battle was on the river called Bassus. 7. The seventh battle was in the Caledonian wood, that is, Cat Coit Celadon. 8. The eighth battle was in Fort Guinan, in which Arthur carried the image of Saint Mary, the Perpetual Virgin, on his shoulders, and the pagans were put to flight on that day, and there was a great slaughter of them through the power of our Lord Jesus Christ and through the power of Saint Mary the Virgin, his mother. 9. The ninth battle was fought in the city of the Legion. 10. The 10th battle was fought on the shore of the river called Tribert. 11. The 11th battle was on the mountain called Aenid. 12. The 12th battle was on Mount Badon, in which 960 men fell in one day from a single charge of Arthur's, and no one laid them low except himself alone, and in all the battles he was victorious. This list has obsessed scholars for over 1,000 years. It's concrete, specific, 12 battles with names and locations. If we could identify these sites, if we could match them to archaeological evidence or other historical sources, we could potentially verify Arthur's existence and chart his campaigns. But here's the problem. Most of these places are completely unidentifiable. Some are maddeningly vague. The river Glane could be one of dozens of rivers. Glane, or Glean, is a common element in British river names, appearing all over the island. Is it the River Glen in Northumberland? The River Glen in Lincolnshire? Some other river whose name has changed? The River Douglas is even worse. Douglas is a British compound word meaning dark water, or black stream. Half the rivers in Britain could fit that description. Where is Linuis? Some have identified it with Lindsey in Lincolnshire. Others have placed it in Scotland. The truth is we don't know. The River Bassus? Unknown. The River Tribert? Unknown. The mountain Aeneid? Unknown, though some manuscripts give variant names that might be identifiable. The Caledonian Wood? Now that's more promising. This was the ancient name for the great forest that once covered southern Scotland. So at least one of Arthur's battles can be placed in a general region. But the Caledonian Wood covered thousands of square miles. Saying Arthur fought there is like saying a battle took place somewhere in Pennsylvania. The city of the legion is better. There were only 2 cities in Roman Britain that housed legions, Chester, Deva, and Caerleon in Wales, Isca. So this battle was probably at one of those 2 sites. But which? And when? And does any archaeological evidence support a major battle there around 500? Fort Guinevere? Unknown. Though Nennius's note that Arthur carried an image of the Virgin Mary is interesting. It firmly places Arthur on the Christian side, fighting against pagans. This is the Christianization of Arthur, the process by which a military commander becomes a champion of the faith. And then Mountbatten. Finally, a name we recognize from Gildas. This is the climactic battle, the decisive victory that won a generation of peace. Nennius confidently places Arthur there, gives him credit for the victory. And then adds that preposterous detail: 960 men fell in one day from a single charge of Arthur's, and no one laid them low except himself alone. 960 men. In one day. Killed by one man. This is not history. This is hyperbole of the most extravagant kind. This is the language of epic poetry, of hero tale, of legend. This is the kind of thing you say about Achilles or Cuchulainn or Sigurd. Heroes of myth who slay impossible numbers of enemies, who fight for days without rest, who are more than human. What's happened here is obvious. Nennius had access to 2 different traditions about Arthur. A historical tradition, Arthur as Dux Bellorum, a real commander fighting real battles at real places, and a legendary tradition, Arthur as superhuman warrior capable of impossible feats. And he included both without apparent discomfort at their contradiction. To Nennius, these weren't contradictory. Arthur could be both, a real historical leader and a legendary hero. The medieval mind didn't have our rigid boundaries between history and legend, fact and story. The past was more fluid, more mythological. Great men naturally attracted exaggerated claims. That didn't make them less real, it made them more real, more worthy of memory. The battle list itself has generated endless theories. One prominent interpretation is that Nennius didn't have historical records at all. Instead, he had an old Welsh poem, a battle-listing poem of the kind that was common in Welsh tradition. These poems celebrated victories by listing them in formulaic language. The number 12 is suspiciously neat, suspiciously symbolic. 12 battles for 12 tribes, 12 apostles, 12 months. 12 appears everywhere in medieval number symbolism. Perhaps the poem originally celebrated British victories over various enemies over a long period. Perhaps different leaders won different battles. But when Nennius found this poem, or when it was recited to him, Arthur's name was attached to all of them. Arthur had become the repository for all British victories, the single hero around whom all resistance to the Saxons had crystallized. So Nennius, taking the poem at face value, attributed all 12 battles to Arthur. He tried to identify the locations, probably based on his own knowledge of Welsh geography and place name traditions. Some identifications he might have had good warrant for. Others he might have been guessing. And then he wrote it all down, creating a text that has haunted historians ever since. Because we can't prove he's wrong. Some of those battles might be real. Some of those place names might be accurate. Arthur might genuinely have fought a campaign across Britain, from the north to the south, from the west to the east, meeting Saxon incursions wherever they threatened. Or the whole thing might be poetry, bardic imagination, wishful thinking formalized into a chronicle. We don't know. The evidence doesn't let us know. Nennius has given us just enough detail to tantalize, but not enough to verify. He's built a bridge across the centuries between the silence of the historical record and the explosion of medieval romance. But it's a rope bridge, swaying in the wind, and we can never be quite sure it will hold our weight. Part 5. The Nature of Memory. Let's pause here before we continue further into the medieval development of the legend. Let's think about something fundamental, how memory works. Not just individual memory, though that's part of it. But collective memory, cultural memory, the way societies remember their past. When you recall an event from your childhood, are you remembering the event itself? Or are you remembering the last time you remembered it? Cognitive scientists have demonstrated something unsettling. Every time we recall a memory, we subtly alter it. We don't play back a recording. We reconstruct the memory from fragments, and in that reconstruction we fill in gaps, smooth out inconsistencies, emphasize certain details while forgetting others. Each act of remembering is also an act of rewriting. And if that's true for individual memory, which operates over mere decades, imagine what happens to cultural memory over centuries. The Arthur story, by the time Nennius wrote it down around 830, had been circulating for at least 3 centuries, possibly more. 300 years of oral transmission. 300 years of bards adapting the story to please different audiences, of proud families claiming descent from Arthur's warriors, of place names being retrofitted into the legend, of local heroes being absorbed into Arthur's warband, of Christian monks adding religious elements, of political leaders invoking Arthur's name to legitimize their rule. Every telling was also a retelling. Every performance was a recreation. In the medieval Welsh tradition, there's a concept called cyfarwydd. The trained storyteller, the repository of tradition, the one who knew the old tales. These men, and occasionally women, underwent years of training. They memorized vast amounts of material, genealogies, king lists, stories, poems. But they weren't memorizing word for word like a modern actor learning a script. They were learning structures, patterns, formulas. They were learning the grammar of heroic narrative, the vocabulary of praise poetry, the rhythm and meter of different poetic forms. They were learning how to improvise within tradition, how to take the essential elements of a story and adapt them to their immediate context. When a cyfarwydd performed in the hall of a Welsh chieftain around the year 700, he knew his audience. He knew their local geography, their political alliances, their family legends, which of their ancestors they were proud of and which they preferred not to mention. And he tailored his performance accordingly. If he was telling the story of Arthur, he would keep the essential elements. Arthur the great war leader, the battles against the Saxons, the ultimate tragedy. But he might adjust the details. He might mention that the battle at the River Douglas happened near a river that flowed through his host's territory. He might note that one of the chieftain's legendary ancestors, 3 generations back, his great-great-grandfather, had been one of Arthur's warriors, had fought at his side at Badon. Was this true? Who could say? Who could contradict? If the chieftain's family had a tradition that their ancestor fought with Arthur, and if everyone in that hall had heard that tradition all their lives, then it was true in the only way that mattered. It was true in memory, in story, in the cultural understanding of who they were and where they came from. The next month, the same cyfarwydd might perform for a different chieftain in a different kingdom, and the details would shift again. Different geography, different ancestors, different battles emphasized. The core story remained, but the specifics were fluid, responsive to context. This isn't lying. This is the nature of oral tradition. The stories are alive, organic, constantly adapting to remain relevant. They're not fixed texts but fluid performances, and their truth is poetic and communal rather than factual and individual. Over time, these variations don't cancel each other out. They accumulate. They create a vast, sprawling, sometimes contradictory body of tradition. Arthur fights battles all over Britain because in different regions, different traditions have placed him there. Arthur's warband includes dozens or hundreds of named warriors because different families, different kingdoms, have added their ancestors to his retinue. Arthur possessed magical weapons, a magical sword, a magical shield, because wonder tales and older mythological motifs have been grafted onto the historical legend. The core, if there is a core, if there was ever a historical Arthur, becomes increasingly buried under layers of accretion, like sedimentary rock building up year after year, until the original substance is compressed into something barely recognizable. And yet, the process isn't entirely random. The stories that survive, that get repeated, that become canonical, are the ones that resonate. They're the ones that speak to something in the cultural psyche, that fulfill a need, that make sense of the world. For the British of the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, watching their territory shrink generation by generation, seeing the Saxon kingdoms expand and consolidate, losing ground militarily and culturally and linguistically, for them the Arthur story served a critical function. It reminded them of who they were. It told them that they were the rightful inhabitants of Britain, the inheritors of Roman civilization. It proved that they could win, had once held back the tide. It promised that the struggle was meaningful, that resistance was possible, that they hadn't always been the losing side. And it gave them a hero who embodied all of this, a figure who could be invoked in poetry and prayer, whose name carried weight, who represented the best of what they had been and what they might be again. This is why the legend survived. Not because the historical facts were carefully preserved, but because the mythological truth was too important to lose. By the time Nennius tried to pin it all down, tried to create a factual chronicle, he was attempting the impossible. He was trying to reverse the process, to extract history from myth. Some of what he recorded might have been based on genuine historical memory. But it had been filtered through so many generations, shaped by so many different interests, embellished by so many bards, that separating the signal from the noise is beyond our ability. We're left with shadows, echoes, hints. We're left with tantalizing possibilities and frustrating ambiguities. We're left with a story that might be history or might be hope, or might be some impossible to disentangle combination of both. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the Arthur we need isn't the Arthur of history but the Arthur of story. Perhaps the truth of the legend doesn't depend on whether a man named Arthur really fought at Badon, but on what the story of that fight has meant to generation after generation after generation. Part 6. The Welsh Wildness. While Nennius was giving us a pseudo-historical Arthur, attempting to document his battles and place him in a chronicle of British kings, the Welsh storytelling tradition was developing something far stranger, far more primal, far more wonderful. A magical Arthur who exists not in history but in myth, not in the world of tactics and strategy but in the world of gods and monsters and impossible deeds. The collection of Welsh tales we now call the Mabinogion, though that's a 19th century invention by Lady Charlotte Guest. The medieval manuscripts don't use that title, gives us a glimpse into this otherworldly Arthur. And it's profoundly disorienting if you come to it expecting the chivalric king of later romance. This Arthur doesn't hold court in Camelot. He doesn't preside over tournaments or send knights on courtly quests. He's wilder, stranger, more dangerous. He's a chieftain in a Bronze Age dreamscape, a figure who belongs more to Celtic mythology than to anything we'd recognize as history. The most revealing of these Welsh tales is Culhwch and Olwen, which scholars believe contains some of the oldest Arthurian material in existence, possibly dating back to the 10th or even 9th century in oral form, though written down much later. Our earliest manuscript is from the 14th century. The plot is simple in outline. A young man named Culhwch is cursed by his stepmother to marry no one except Olwen, daughter of the giant Ysbaddaden. Culhwch travels to Arthur's court to ask for help. Arthur agrees, and he and his warriors assist Culhwch in completing the impossible tasks Ysbaddaden sets as the bride price. But the simplicity of the outline hides the absolute strangeness of the execution. First, there's the description of Arthur's court. The roll call of his warriors is one of the most bizarre galleries of heroes you'll ever encounter in literature. There are over 200 names listed, and while some are recognizable from later Arthurian tradition, Kai, Bedwyr, Gawain, most are utterly obscure and many have transparently mythological characteristics. There's Kai, later Sir Kay, but this isn't the churlish seneschal of medieval romance. This Kai can hold his breath for 9 days and 9 nights underwater. He can go 9 days and 9 nights without sleep. He can make himself as tall as the tallest tree in the forest when he wishes. He generates so much body heat that when it rains, everything he's carrying stays perfectly dry, and in the coldest weather, he's a source of fire for his companions to warm themselves. There's Bedwyr, later Sir Bedivere, who despite having only one hand is the most handsome of Arthur's warriors, and so attractive that no woman can refuse him. And when he thrusts with his spear it makes 9 wounds, 1 for the spear itself and 8 for the air moving around it. There's a man named Clust son of Clustfinet, who can hear an ant stirring from 50 miles away. There's Medr son of Methredid, who can shoot an arrow through a wren's leg from Scotland to Cornwall. There's Uchtdraid Crossbeard, whose beard spreads out across the 50 rafters of Arthur's hall. When he's sad, his beard droops down to his feet, but when he's happy, it lifts up and becomes a stepping stone for men crossing rivers. This is not realism. This is not even remotely historical fiction. This is folklore operating on a different register entirely, where the boundaries between human and supernatural, between possible and impossible, have completely dissolved. And Arthur in this world isn't separate from this wildness. He's the center of gravity around which all these impossible heroes orbit. He's their king, yes, but he's also their companion in adventure. He's as likely to be out hunting magical beasts as sitting in his hall dispensing justice. When young Culhwch arrives at the court seeking help, there's a wonderful scene that captures the flavor of this Welsh Arthur. Culhwch's arrival is described in extravagant detail. His horse, his weapons, his clothing, everything about him chosen to emphasize that he's noble, high-born, someone who should be taken seriously. But when he reaches the gate, the porter refuses to admit him. It's New Year's Day, the porter explains, and on that day no one may enter except a king or his entourage. Culhwch threatens and blusters, and finally Arthur, hearing the commotion, asks what's happening. When he learns there's a nobleman seeking entry, Arthur immediately orders the gates opened. His reasoning is wonderfully characteristic. Let him in. It's disgraceful to leave such a man standing at the door in wind and rain. This is a different kind of kingship than the stiff formality of later medieval romance. Arthur is generous, impulsive, concerned with honor and hospitality rather than protocol. And when Culhwch explains his quest, Arthur doesn't hesitate. Of course he'll help. They're cousins after all. In the Welsh tradition, everyone of noble birth is related to Arthur somehow, and beyond that it's simply what one does. A young man needs help winning his bride? Arthur and his warriors will provide that help. What follows is a series of adventures that blend heroic realism with utter fantasy. Some of the tasks Ysbaddaden sets are practical. Clear this land, plow that field, obtain these rare tools. Others are magical. Get the comb and shears from between the ears of the boar twrchwh, obtain the blood of the black witch, secure the leash made from the beard of a king. The climax of the story is the hunt for twrchwh, the great magical boar. And here the tale becomes explicitly mythological. Twrchwh wasn't always a boar. He was once a king transformed by God as punishment for his sins. Now he rampages across the landscape with 7 young pigs accompanying him, and he's apparently cognizant enough to understand speech and to deliberately lead his hunters into danger. Arthur and his warriors hunt twrchwh across Wales, across Ireland, back to Wales, down through Cornwall. The boar kills dozens of Arthur's men. He destroys whole regions. The landscape itself becomes part of the story, the places where twrchwh stops, the valleys where battles are fought, the rivers he crosses. All of these become ideological myths, stories that explain why places have certain names or certain features. This is the boar that gave its name to such and such mountain. This is the valley where Arthur's warrior fell and was buried. This is the river stained red with the blood of that day's fighting. The geography of Wales itself becomes Arthur's story, becomes evidence of his existence not as a historical king but as a mythological hero who shaped the very land. And it's not just Culhwch and Olwen. There are other Welsh tales and poems where Arthur appears in similarly mythological contexts. In Priadw Anonfyn, The Spoils of Anonfyn, an enigmatic poem from the Book of Taliesin, Arthur leads a raid on the otherworld, Anonfyn, the Celtic land of the dead, to steal a magical cauldron. Only 7 men return from this expedition into the realm of ghosts and gods. In the Welsh Triads, collections of bardic lore organized in groups of 3 for easier memorization, Arthur appears in various contexts, some historical seeming, some overtly magical. One triad mentions the 3 fortunate concealments of the island of Britain, one of which is the head of Bran the Blessed, buried in London to protect Britain from invasion. Another triad mentions that Arthur foolishly dug up this head, declaring that Britain should be defended by strength of arms, not by magic, and thus brought about the eventual Saxon conquest. These are not the acts of a Christian king. This is Arthur as Celtic hero, Arthur dealing with the old gods and the old magic, Arthur participating in a mythological landscape that has nothing to do with Roman Britain or historical battles. Some scholars argue that this mythical Arthur is actually the older tradition, more ancient than the historical Arthur. They suggest that Arthur wasn't originally a man at all, but a British god, possibly a bear god since Ardos means bear in Brythonic Celtic. In this view, Arthur was a deity of the pre-Christian Britons, probably associated with strength, protection, perhaps kingship. As Christianity spread through Britain, this god would have been euhemerized, transformed from a divine being into a legendary human king. This was a common process in early medieval Europe. The pagan gods didn't simply disappear when Christianity arrived. They were demoted, turned into kings and heroes of the ancient past, stripped of their explicit divinity but retaining their supernatural characteristics in attenuated form. If this theory is correct, the historical Arthur is the later invention, the result of Christians trying to rationalize pagan myths into acceptable history. The giant killing, otherworld raiding, magical Arthur of the Welsh tales is closer to the original conception. Other scholars argue the reverse, that there was a real Arthur, a real war leader, whose fame was so great that over time his story accumulated mythological elements. He became a magnet for older tales and older heroes. Local legends attached themselves to his name. Older mythological narratives were retrofitted to feature him as protagonist. The Welsh tradition in this view represents not the survival of an ancient god myth, but the natural process by which a historical hero becomes legendary. Give a famous man a few generations of oral tradition, and he'll be fighting giants and raiding the otherworld before you know it. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between, or more accurately, exists in a space where the question of historical versus mythological becomes meaningless. Arthur is both. He's neither. He exists in that liminal space between human and divine, between history and myth, where the most powerful stories have always lived. What we can say with certainty is this: by the 10th and 11th centuries, Arthur occupies a unique position in British culture. He appears in chronicles that present themselves as history, placed in a definite historical period, fighting real enemies in real places. And he simultaneously appears in magical tales where he hunts impossible beasts, commands supernatural warriors, and raids the land of the dead. Medieval Welsh audiences didn't seem troubled by this contradiction. The same culture that produced Nennius's battle list also produced Culhwch and Olwen. The same bards who sang of Arthur's historical battles also sang of his magical adventures. These weren't separate traditions requiring reconciliation. They were different aspects of the same hero, different registers in which his story could be told. To the medieval mind, great heroes necessarily partook of both realms. Their achievements were so extraordinary that they blurred the line between possible and impossible. Their fame was so great that it attracted wonder stories like iron filings to a magnet. And that was appropriate. That was how heroes should be remembered, as larger than life, as touching the numinous, as belonging not just to history but to the realm of myth and meaning. Arthur was real enough that his name appeared in chronicles and king lists. He was legendary enough that he fought giants, hunted magical boars, and raided the otherworld. He existed in that ambiguous space, that fertile ground, where a culture's need for heroes meets its need for myths. And he was about to cross the channel, about to undergo another transformation, about to become something even greater and even more distant from whatever historical truth might have spawned him. Part 7. The Monk Who Invented England. Everything changes with one man, Geoffrey of Monmouth. Before Geoffrey, Arthur was a Welsh hero, celebrated in Welsh poetry, mentioned in Welsh chronicles, the property of a culture that was increasingly marginalized, pushed to the western edges of Britain. Arthur mattered to the Welsh and to the Cornish and to the Bretons who'd fled across the Channel in the face of Saxon expansion. But to the English, to the descendants of those same Saxons, Arthur was either unknown or was the enemy, the man who'd killed their ancestors at Badon. After Geoffrey, Arthur became the property of all Europe, the central figure in a literary tradition that would shape Western culture for 1,000 years. Geoffrey was a Welsh cleric. His name suggests Welsh origin, Monmouth being a town on the Welsh-English border, working in Oxford in the 1130s. It was a time of tremendous political upheaval. England was convulsed by civil war, the period known as the Anarchy, as Stephen and Matilda fought for the throne. The Norman aristocracy that had conquered England in 1066 was still, 3 generations later, trying to solidify its legitimacy. These Norman lords controlled the land, held the castles, commanded the armies. But they didn't control the narrative. They were French speakers ruling over English speakers, conquerors holding territory taken by force, a military elite without deep roots in the soil they'd claimed. What they needed was a founding myth, a story that could legitimize their rule, that could connect them to a glorious British past, that could make their conquest seem like destiny rather than simple violence. Geoffrey saw the opportunity and seized it with both hands. Around 1136 he produced a book that would reshape European literature, that would give birth to the Arthur we think we know today, that would become one of the most influential works of the entire Middle Ages, Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. In his preface, Geoffrey makes a specific claim about his sources. He writes that he's not inventing this history, merely translating it from a certain very ancient book in the British language, given to him by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. This book, Geoffrey claims, contains the complete history of British kings from the earliest times to the Saxon conquest, told in proper order with proper detail. This book, if it ever existed, has never been found. No one has ever seen it. No other medieval writer mentions it, despite the fact that after Geoffrey's work became famous, such an ancient British book would have been considered a priceless historical treasure. Most modern scholars believe Geoffrey made it up. The ancient British book was a rhetorical device, a way to give his own creative work the authority of ancient history. It was a common technique. Medieval writers often claimed to be merely translating or transcribing older sources, even when they were actually inventing wholesale. Why? Because originality wasn't prized the way it is in modern literature. Ancient authorities were considered more reliable than contemporary authors. If you wanted your work to be taken seriously, you claimed it was based on old, venerable sources. You were just the humble transmitter, preserving ancient wisdom for modern audiences. So Geoffrey, with his non-existent British book, set about creating a comprehensive history of Britain that would fill all those frustrating gaps, that would answer all those nagging questions, that would give Britain a past as glorious as Rome's. What he produced was audacious in scope and utterly revolutionary in impact. Geoffrey's history begins with Brutus, great-grandson of Aeneas of Troy, who supposedly led a group of Trojan refugees to Britain and founded a kingdom there, naming the island after himself, Britain from Brutus. This immediately places the British on the same level as the Romans, who also claimed Trojan ancestry through Aeneas. The history then proceeds through a long line of kings, some of whom are genuine historical figures from Celtic tradition, many of whom are Geoffrey's inventions. He gives us Lear, later Shakespeare's King Lear, Cymbeline, Vortigern who invited the Saxons, Uther Pendragon, and finally Arthur. Geoffrey's Arthur is no longer the Dux Bellorum of Nennius, the military commander fighting a defensive war. He's a king. More than that, he's a conquering emperor, the greatest king Britain has ever known or ever will know. Geoffrey gives Arthur a proper birth story, and in doing so he essentially invents Merlin. He takes two separate figures from Welsh tradition, Ambrosius the boy prophet from Nennius, and Myrddin Wrlt, a mad prophet of the northern forests from separate Welsh poems, and combines them into Merlin the wizard. The story Geoffrey tells is dramatic. Uther Pendragon, king of Britain, desires Igraine, wife of the Duke of Cornwall. Merlin, using his magical arts, transforms Uther to look exactly like Igraine's husband. Uther, in this disguise, sleeps with Igraine. That same night, her actual husband dies in battle. Arthur is conceived in this act of magical deception. Born from desire and illusion and death, his very origin a tangle of questionable ethics. Igraine later marries Uther legitimately, making Arthur legal heir to the throne, but that origin story haunts the narrative. Arthur is both legitimate and illegitimate, both rightful heir and product of deception. It's a more complex origin than the simple heroic birth tale, and it introduces moral ambiguity from the start. Geoffrey then describes Arthur's conquests. After subduing Britain, Arthur doesn't stop. He conquers Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Denmark. He conquers all of Gaul, France, defeating the Roman tribune who governs it. He establishes a court so magnificent, so wealthy, so cultured that knights come from all over the known world to join it. Geoffrey locates this court at a place he calls Caerleon in Wales, identifying it with the old Roman legionary fortress there. His description is lavish. The city has churches with towers reaching to the clouds, schools for scholars in every discipline, hundreds of nobles and residents. When Arthur holds court, it's a spectacle of unimaginable splendor. The knights who serve Arthur are divided into orders, wearing distinctive clothing to show their rank. They engage in mock battles and tournaments, demonstrating their skill. The ladies of the court watch from the walls and bestow their favor on the most valiant. It's courtly, civilized, sophisticated, everything the Norman aristocracy aspired to be. Geoffrey is projecting 12th century Norman court culture backward onto the 6th century. He's creating an idealized vision of chivalric society, making Arthur's court the template, the golden age that all subsequent courts should try to emulate. In Geoffrey's narrative, Arthur is about to march on Rome itself when disaster strikes. Word reaches him that his nephew Mordred has betrayed him, seizing both the throne and Guinevere, whom Geoffrey mentions but doesn't develop as a character. Arthur returns to Britain and fights a final, catastrophic civil war. The Battle of Camelot is brutal. Arthur kills Mordred, but he himself is mortally wounded. And here Geoffrey does something subtle and brilliant. He doesn't say Arthur died. He says Arthur was carried off to the Isle of Avalon for his wounds to be healed, and gives the year as 542 CE. That ambiguity, that open ending, that refusal to explicitly confirm Arthur's death, would prove to be one of the most powerful narrative devices in Western literature. It left the door open. It allowed for the hope, the possibility that Arthur might return. Geoffrey's Historia was an instant, overwhelming success. It became a medieval bestseller. Within decades it had been translated from Latin into French, into Welsh, into English. Over 200 manuscript copies survive from the Middle Ages, an extraordinary number indicating that it was widely read, widely copied, widely distributed. And here's the crucial point. For the next 400 years, it was considered history. Not romance, not legend, but actual factual history, as authoritative as anything written by ancient historians. Chronicles incorporated Geoffrey's narrative. When later medieval writers discussed British history, they cited Geoffrey as their source. His dates, his king lists, his account of Arthur, all were accepted as legitimate historical material. Kings cited him. Edward I of England, when asserting his overlordship over Scotland, cited Geoffrey's Historia as proof that Britain had anciently been united under a single king. Later English monarchs would continue to invoke Geoffrey's Arthur as precedent for their territorial claims. Think about what Geoffrey accomplished. He took a fragmented, contradictory, mostly oral Welsh tradition and forged it into a coherent, compelling, pseudo-historical narrative that satisfied the political needs of his time. The Norman rulers got an epic that made Britain's past equal to Rome's. They gave their conquered territory a glorious history worthy of their rule. The Welsh got their hero preserved and elevated, transformed from a local war leader into a world historical emperor. The Church got a powerful king who fought for Christianity against pagan enemies. And readers got a story that was infinitely better than anything based solely on accurate historical facts could have been. Geoffrey gave them drama, spectacle, tragedy, magic, romance, and hope. He created a narrative that resonated so deeply with medieval sensibilities that it became, in effect, Britain's national myth. But there was a problem. Geoffrey had built the magnificent stage, introduced the main actors, established the basic plot. But his focus was on the political drama, the wars, the conquests, the betrayals. He'd created Arthur the king, Arthur the emperor, Arthur the tragic hero. But he'd left the human drama underdeveloped. His Arthur is more icon than character. He's magnificent, powerful, successful, and a bit distant. We don't get inside his head. We don't understand his relationships, his doubts, his inner life. Geoffrey's narrative is external, descriptive, concerned with what happens rather than why it happens or how people feel about it. For that deeper human drama, for the exploration of psychology and emotion and moral complexity, the Arthur legend would need something Geoffrey couldn't provide. It would need the French. Continued in next section due to length. Part 8. The invention of romance. In the 1160s and 1170s, something remarkable happened in the courts of France. A new kind of literature emerged, aimed at a new kind of audience, exploring themes that had been largely absent from earlier medieval literature. The key figure, the catalyst for this transformation, was a woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was one of the most powerful, cultured, and influential women of the 12th century, perhaps of the entire Middle Ages. Born into the nobility of southern France, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine as a teenager, making her one of the wealthiest people in Europe. She was Queen of France through her first marriage, then Queen of England through her second, to Henry II. She was mother to Richard the Lionheart and King John. She lived into her 80s, wielding political power and cultural influence across decades. And she was bored with the existing literary offerings. The dominant form of medieval literature up to that point had been the chanson de geste, the song of heroic deeds. These were epic poems celebrating martial valor, usually focused on conflicts between Christians and Muslims, like the Song of Roland, or on conflicts between nobles and their enemies. They were stories of battles, sieges, feuds, and revenge. They were, essentially, stories about men doing violent things to other men. The emotional range was limited. Heroes were brave, generous to their followers, fierce to their enemies, loyal to their lords. The psychology was simple. Motivations were straightforward: honor, revenge, duty. Eleanor and the women of her court wanted something different. They were educated, politically savvy, capable of subtle thought. They wanted literature that reflected their own experiences and concerns. They wanted stories about relationships, about the inner lives of characters, about moral complexity. They wanted stories about love. Eleanor's daughter Marie, Countess of Champagne, inherited her mother's literary interests and patronage. And it was under Marie's sponsorship that a poet named Crétin de Troyes revolutionized Arthurian literature. We know almost nothing about Crétin personally, we don't even know his exact dates. But his works survive and they're extraordinary. Between roughly 1160 and 1190, he wrote 5 Arthurian romances that essentially invented the genre as we know it. Crétin took Geoffrey's historical framework, Arthur as king, the court as center of civilization, and did something revolutionary. He made the stories about individuals. Not about nations or battles or dynasties, but about individual knights and their personal struggles. His first Arthurian romance, Eric and Enid, establishes the pattern. The conflict isn't about Saxon invasions or territorial conquest. It's about a knight named Eric who falls so deeply in love with his wife Enid that he begins to neglect his martial duties. He spends all his time with her, loses his reputation for prowess, becomes an object of mockery. His wife, overhearing people say he's been weakened by love, is mortified. Eric, to prove himself, drags her on a series of adventures where he fights foes and rights wrongs, treating her harshly to test her loyalty. It's a story about the tension between private life and public duty, about the balance between love and honor, about male pride and female suffering. These are personal, psychological conflicts. The external plot, the adventures, the fights, serves the internal character development. This was new. This was different. And audiences loved it. In Yvain, the Knight of the Lion, Crétin explores similar themes from a different angle. Yvain marries a lady but then leaves her to go adventuring with his friend Gawain. He promises to return within a year. He gets caught up in the adventure, loses track of time and breaks his promise. His wife, feeling betrayed, renounces him. Yvain goes mad with grief and remorse. The rest of the romance is about his long road to redemption, as he performs heroic deeds, aided by a lion he's befriended, hence the title, and gradually proves himself worthy of his wife's forgiveness. Again, the story is psychological. It's about guilt, redemption, the consequences of broken promises, the difficulty of balancing competing obligations. But Crétin's most influential innovation was his portrayal of love itself. In the courts of southern France, a literary and social game had developed called courtly love, or fin amours, refined love. The concept was radical. The highest form of love was passionate, individualistic, freely chosen, and often adulterous. A knight would devote himself absolutely to a lady, usually his lord's wife, a woman of higher social status than himself. He would worship her from afar, compose poetry for her, perform deeds of valor in her name. She was his inspiration, his reason for excellence. His love for her made him a better knight, a better person. This love was almost never consummated. It couldn't be. The lady was married, bound by duty and law to her husband. The impossibility was the point. Desire was ennobling precisely because it was frustrated, refined by restraint into something spiritual. This was a literary fantasy, a game played in courtly circles, an inversion of the normal social order where marriages were political arrangements and women's desires were irrelevant. In the world of courtly love literature, women held power. They were judges of worth, arbiters of honor. Men competed for their favor not through wealth or political connections but through genuine merit and devotion. It allowed educated noble women to imagine a world where they had agency, where they could choose, where their feelings mattered. And into this framework, Crétin introduced the most dangerous and most enduring element in all Arthurian legend. He gave Arthur's queen a lover. In Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Crétin, possibly at Marie de Champagne's specific instruction, the prologue suggests she gave him the material and the theme, tells the story of the greatest knight in the world who loves Guinevere with absolute devotion. The plot is elaborate. Guinevere is abducted, taken to a mysterious otherworldly kingdom from which no one returns. Lancelot pursues her. To save her, he must ride in a cart, a vehicle of shame used to transport criminals. For a knight, this is ultimate humiliation. To be seen riding in the cart will destroy his reputation forever. He hesitates for 2 steps, just 2 steps, a moment's pause, before climbing in. That hesitation, that instant of doubt, will haunt him throughout the story. When he finally rescues Guinevere, she's cold to him. Why? Because he hesitated. Even for 2 steps, he put his honor before his love for her. That's unforgivable. Crétin explores the psychology of this with remarkable subtlety. Lancelot is destroyed by her disapproval, almost suicidal. Only when she finally forgives him does he return to himself. His entire sense of worth is tied to her regard. He's the greatest knight in the world, able to defeat any opponent, but her smallest frown unmans him completely. And yes, they're lovers. The romance makes this explicit. Lancelot sneaks into her chamber, bends the iron bars of her window with his bare hands, cutting his hands bloody in the process, and spends the night with her. The next morning, blood from his wounded hands is found on her sheets. Her abductor accuses her of sleeping with another knight, one who's been wounded in fighting. Lancelot must fight a duel to defend her honor, all while concealing that he is indeed the source of the blood stains. It's a delicious tangle of adultery, deception, and perverted honor. Lancelot fights to defend Guinevere's honor, her reputation for chastity, when in fact she's guilty of exactly what she's accused of and he's her accomplice. Crétin himself seems to have been uncomfortable with this material. He abandoned the romance unfinished, leaving another poet, Godefroy de Lagny, to complete it. Perhaps he realized what he'd done. He'd placed a ticking time bomb at the heart of Arthur's court. If the greatest knight is sleeping with the queen, what does that say about Arthur? Is he a cuckold? Is he willfully blind? If he knows and tolerates it, is he weak? If he doesn't know, is he a fool? And what does it say about the chivalric system itself? If the very exemplar of knighthood, the man all others try to emulate, has betrayed his king and lord in the most intimate possible way, then what's the foundation of honor? What's the meaning of loyalty? Later writers would struggle mightily with this problem. Some would try to minimize it, suggesting the affair was platonic, a matter of longing glances rather than physical consummation. Others would embrace it but add layers of moral complexity, showing Lancelot tormented by guilt, unable to stop himself, destroyed by the contradiction between his love and his duty. The 13th century Vulgate cycle would attempt a grand theological solution, making Lancelot's adultery the sin that prevents him from achieving the Holy Grail. He's the greatest earthly knight, but earthly excellence isn't enough for spiritual perfection. His love for Guinevere, however refined, however ennobling, is still sin and it damns him. But the damage was done. Crétin had created a narrative tension that couldn't be resolved, only explored. The love triangle of Arthur Guinevere Lancelot would become central to the legend, the secret flaw that would eventually bring down Camelot. And yet it made the legend richer, more human, more tragic. Because now the fall of Arthur's kingdom wasn't just about external enemies or political betrayal. It was about human weakness, about the conflict between passion and duty, about the impossibility of perfecting human institutions because humans themselves are flawed. Crétin had transformed Arthur from Geoffrey's conquering emperor into something more complex. The king who built something beautiful that was doomed from within. Part 9. The Grail. The final element, the piece that would give the Arthurian legend its lasting spiritual dimension and transform it from secular romance into religious allegory, appeared almost by accident in Crétin's last unfinished work. Perceval, or the Story of the Grail, was written in the 1180s and left incomplete at Crétin's death. It tells the story of a naive young man raised by his mother in the wilderness, ignorant of knighthood. When he sees knights for the first time, he's so dazzled he assumes they're angels. He demands to become a knight himself, leaves his mother, who dies of grief at his departure, an early indication that this knight-errant business has costs, and rides off to Arthur's court. Perceval is portrayed as almost comically ignorant of courtly manners. He's brave and naturally gifted with weapons, but he has no idea how to behave. The early sections are filled with humor as he blunders through situations, interpreting knightly advice with literal-minded foolishness. But then, midway through the romance, the tone shifts dramatically. Perceval finds himself at a mysterious castle, hosted by a wounded king called the Fisher King. During dinner, a strange procession passes through the hall. First, a young man carrying a white lance, from whose tip a drop of blood runs down to his hand. Then 2 young men carrying candlesticks. Then a beautiful maiden carrying a jeweled serving dish, a graal. Then another maiden carrying a silver platter. The procession passes through without explanation. Perceval, remembering advice he'd been given about not talking too much, doesn't ask about what he's seeing. The Fisher King seems to be waiting for something, but Perceval stays silent. Eventually the evening ends, Perceval goes to sleep, and when he wakes, the castle is empty. He rides away puzzled. Later he learns his error. He should have asked about the Grail. If he had asked, "Whom does the Grail serve?" or "Why does the lance bleed?" the Fisher King would have been healed of his wound, and his wasted land would have been restored. By failing to ask, Perceval has failed a crucial test. And that's where Crétin leaves it. He never tells us what the Grail is. He never explains the bleeding lance, the wound, the wasteland. The poem breaks off in mid-adventure, leaving one of the greatest cliffhangers in literary history. Crétin's death left a vacuum, and medieval writers rushed to fill it. Multiple continuations of Perceval were written, each attempting to complete the story and explain the mysteries. And in these continuations, and in other Grail romances written in the early 13th century, the Grail underwent a remarkable transformation. It was Christianized, elevated, made into something world historically important. Robert de Boron, writing around 1200, explicitly identified the Grail with the cup from the Last Supper, the vessel Christ used when he instituted the Eucharist, the chalice that, according to later legend, had been used to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion. Suddenly this serving dish from Crétin's romance became the serving dish, the Holy Grail, the most sacred relic in Christendom, imbued with divine power, the object of the ultimate quest. The Vulgate cycle, written by Cistercian monks in the early 13th century, created a massive, coherent narrative framework incorporating the Grail into Arthurian legend. The cycle is enormous, over 3,000 pages in modern editions, comprising 5 major sections that tell the story from the time of Joseph of Arimathea, who brings the Grail to Britain, through Arthur's birth, his reign, the adventures of the knights, the Grail quest, and finally the death of Arthur. This was a deliberate attempt to create a Christian epic for the Middle Ages, comparable to Virgil's Aeneid or the Bible's own narrative arc. The monks who wrote it were trying to reconcile the secular Romance tradition with Orthodox Christian theology. Their solution was to introduce Galahad. Galahad is Lancelot's son, born from a one-night encounter with the daughter of the Fisher King. Lancelot was tricked into sleeping with her, thinking she was Guinevere, a complex episode that shows how tangled the narrative has become. Galahad is pure where Lancelot is flawed, virgin where Lancelot is adulterous, focused where Lancelot is torn. When Galahad arrives at Arthur's court, a mysterious sword appears embedded in a stone floating in the river. Only the world's best knight can draw it. Lancelot can't. Gawain can't. But Galahad draws it effortlessly, revealing his predestined role. The Grail quest is announced. A vision of the Holy Grail appears in Arthur's hall, filling it with light and wonderful smells and miraculous food. The knights all swear to seek the Grail, to discover its secrets, to achieve it. Gawain leads the way and 150 knights follow. But Arthur weeps because he knows this means the end of the Round Table. The knights are leaving on a quest from which many won't return, and even those who do will be changed. He's right. The Grail quest devastates the Round Table. Knights ride out confidently and never come back, killed in adventure or dead of spiritual failure. Some go mad. Some fall into sin and lose themselves. Only 3 knights achieve the Grail: Galahad, Perceval, and Bors. They experience a vision of the divine mysteries. They see the Grail in its full spiritual glory. Galahad is even permitted to look directly into the Grail and see the Eucharistic miracle. In that moment of perfect vision, he asks to die, unable and unwilling to return to the fallen world after experiencing such perfection. His prayer is granted. He dies in mystical ecstasy. Perceval stays at the Grail castle as the new Fisher King but dies within a year. Only Bors returns to Camelot to tell the tale. The theological message is clear and brutal. Worldly chivalry isn't enough. Lancelot, for all his prowess, is damned by his sin. Gawain, for all his fame, fails because he's too worldly, too fond of earthly pleasures. The Round Table, for all its glory, is spiritually bankrupt. True perfection requires renouncing the world. Galahad achieves the Grail and immediately dies because there's nothing left for him in mortal life. The only knight who achieves the Grail and returns to the world is Bors, and he's characterized throughout as rather dull, colorless, defined almost entirely by his chastity and his lack of passionate attachments. This is medieval monasticism in fictional form. The monks who wrote the Vulgate are arguing that the heroic secular life, the knightly ideal, is inferior to the religious life. The best you can do in the world is sacrifice it, leave it behind, seek God alone. But this creates a devastating narrative problem. If the Grail quest is the pinnacle of the Arthurian story, if achieving it means leaving the world, then what comes after? What's left is Camelot's destruction. Having achieved the spiritual quest and found it incompatible with worldly life, the surviving knights return to a court that suddenly seems hollow. The best knights are gone. The fellowship is shattered. And waiting there are all the old unresolved tensions. Lancelot and Guinevere's affair, Mordred's envy and treachery, the accumulated sins and betrayals that have been building for years. The fall, when it comes, is total. The affair is exposed. Lancelot rescues Guinevere from execution, but in doing so kills several knights, including Gawain's brothers. Gawain, who'd been Lancelot's friend, becomes his implacable enemy, demanding vengeance. Arthur is forced to go to war against his greatest knight. While Arthur is besieging Lancelot in France, Mordred seizes power in Britain. Arthur returns. The final battle at Camelot is apocalyptic. Father against son, brother against brother, the entire Round Table tearing itself apart. Almost everyone dies. The kingdom is ruined. Arthur kills Mordred but is mortally wounded. He's carried to Avalon, where he may be healed or may be dead or may be sleeping. The ambiguity Geoffrey introduced is preserved. The Vulgate cycle ends in ashes and lamentation. Everything built has been destroyed. The glory is gone. All that remains is ruin and the faint hope that someday, somehow, Arthur might return. This is the complete Arthurian legend as the Middle Ages shaped it. A vast, sprawling, theologically complex narrative that moves from the heights of worldly glory, Arthur's conquests and the establishment of the Round Table, through spiritual quest, the search for the Grail, to ultimate catastrophe, the civil war and death. It's a tragedy, but a particular kind of medieval tragedy. It's about the impossibility of perfecting earthly institutions, about the inevitability of sin, about the conflict between worldly excellence and spiritual salvation. And yet, despite or because of its tragic arc, it became the defining story of medieval aristocratic culture. The Arthurian legend was copied, translated, adapted, and performed across Europe. It shaped how the nobility thought about knighthood, honor, love, and duty. It was never just a story. It was a mirror in which the medieval world saw its idealized self, and saw, perhaps, the fatal flaws that would bring down that world. Part 10. The Archaeology of Legend. Let's return, after this long journey through literary development, to the question we started with. Was there a historical Arthur? We've traveled through 8 centuries of legend building, from the darkness of sub-Roman Britain through the literary inventions of the High Middle Ages. We've seen how a possible historical figure was transformed into a mythological hero, then into a king, then into a Christian exemplar, then into a tragic protagonist in a vast theological drama. But what about the man himself? What does modern archaeology and historical scholarship tell us? The tools available to us now would astound Nennius and Geoffrey. We can use dendrochronology, tree-ring dating, to date wooden structures with remarkable precision. We can use radiocarbon dating to establish chronologies. We can use soil analysis, pollen analysis, and metallurgical analysis to understand ancient landscapes and economies. We can employ LiDAR, light detection and ranging, to reveal hidden earthworks beneath forests and fields. What have we found? First, we know the broad historical framework is accurate. The Anglo-Saxon migrations happened, though migration is perhaps the wrong word. It wasn't a sudden invasion but a process, uneven and complex, that unfolded over centuries. Some Saxons came as raiders, others as invited mercenaries, others as settlers moving into depopulated areas. The Romano-British culture was displaced, though not instantly and not uniformly. In some areas, British and Saxon populations coexisted for generations. In others, the transition was violent and swift. The linguistic evidence is stark. English is fundamentally a Germanic language. If the Romano-British population had remained demographically dominant, we'd expect to see more Celtic borrowings. The fact that we don't suggest significant population replacement, whether through displacement, migration, or violence. There was resistance. This much is certain. Gildas confirms it. Archaeological evidence supports it. The Saxon advance was not unopposed. Second, we found evidence of massive refortification at several sites during exactly the right period, the late 5th and early 6th centuries. The most dramatic example is Cadbury Castle in Somerset. Not an actual castle, that's a later name, but a prehistoric hill fort, a massive Iron Age earthwork that had been abandoned for centuries. Around 500 CE, someone refortified it on an impressive scale. Archaeological excavations in the 1960s revealed that the ancient ramparts had been rebuilt using timber-laced construction, huge wooden beams holding together the earth and stone walls. This was sophisticated military architecture, requiring organizational capacity, resources, and knowledge. At the summit of the hill, excavators found evidence of a large timber hall, a feasting hall of the kind where a great lord would entertain his warriors. Some powerful leader, commanded the resources and manpower to do this. They chose a site with tremendous defensive advantages and symbolic weight, an ancient hill fort, connecting themselves to pre-Roman British heritage. They built fortifications that could house a warband and resist siege. Could this have been Arthur's fortress? Medieval tradition actually identified Cadbury Castle with Camelot. Local place names refer to it as Arthur's Palace. But such traditions prove nothing. Arthur's name attached itself to impressive ruins all over Britain. What we can say is that someone, in the right period, fortified Cadbury Castle on a scale that suggests military leadership of exactly the kind Arthur supposedly provided. Whether that someone was the man we call Arthur, or whether Arthur's legend later absorbed the real leader's achievements, we cannot know. Other sites show similar patterns. Tintagel in Cornwall, traditionally associated with Arthur's conception in Geoffrey's story, shows evidence of high-status occupation in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. It wasn't a castle, the ruins tourists see are much later, but it was something, a trading post, a stronghold, a center of power. Mediterranean pottery has been found there, suggesting connections to long-distance trade networks, suggesting wealth and importance. South Cadbury, Glastonbury Tor, possibly Dinas Powys in Wales, all show evidence of refortification or high-status occupation in the Arthurian period. Someone was building strongholds, consolidating power, organizing resistance. Third, we have the Battle of Badon. Gildas confirms it happened, that it was decisive, that it led to a generation of peace. Other sources suggest it occurred around 500 CE, give or take a decade. But where? Despite centuries of searching, we can't locate it. Bath seems likely. Badon might derive from the British name for Bath. But there's no archaeological evidence of a battle there. Badbury Rings in Dorset has been proposed. So have various hill forts across southern England. Some scholars have even suggested it wasn't a siege of a hill at all, that Gildas's Mons Badonicus should be interpreted differently. Without knowing where Badon was fought, we can't excavate it, can't look for the physical evidence, weapons, armor, burials, that might confirm or deny the legends. Fourth, we have the complete absence of contemporary evidence for Arthur specifically. No inscriptions bearing his name from the 5th or 6th centuries. No coins. No diplomatic correspondence. No contemporary chronicle mentions him. The silence remains profound and puzzling. This negative evidence isn't conclusive. The period is so poorly documented that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Many people who certainly existed left no direct traces. The silence proves only that if Arthur existed, he didn't have the kind of prominence that would guarantee his name's preservation in the handful of documents that survive. But it's suggestive. If Arthur was the great unifying king-emperor of Geoffrey's imagination, ruling for decades, conquering much of Europe, we would expect more traces. The smaller, more localized figure of Nennius, a military commander, a dux bellorum, could more easily slip through the cracks of history. The current scholarly consensus, insofar as there is one, goes something like this. There may have been a historical figure, possibly named Arthur or bearing a title that was later understood as a name, who played some significant military role in British resistance against Saxon expansion around 500 CE. This figure was probably not a king but a military leader, possibly coordinating the forces of multiple British kingdoms, possibly holding some Roman-derived military title. His achievements, while real, were probably more limited than later legend suggests. He may have won a significant victory, possibly at Badon, may have briefly halted Saxon expansion, may have bought his people some breathing space. But his reputation was exaggerated fairly quickly, perhaps within a generation or two. His story absorbed other local heroes, other victories, other legends. By the time anything was written down, 300+ years later, the historical core, if it existed, was already deeply buried under layers of legend, bardic elaboration, and political propaganda. What we have, therefore, is less a historical king and more a cultural memory of resistance, crystallized around a name. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all we need. Because the question, was Arthur real? May be the wrong question. The better question is, what need did the Arthur legend fulfill, and why has it persisted? Part 11, The Mirror. Let me suggest that Arthur survives not in spite of his historical ambiguity but because of it. Because he's not pinned to specific dates and places and facts, he can be reshaped by each era to reflect that era's needs and anxieties. Unlike Charlemagne, who is definitively historical, extensively documented, and therefore fixed in time and character, Arthur exists in a mist. He's malleable, adaptable, endlessly renewable. Every age has created its own Arthur. For the 12th century Anglo-Normans, Arthur was the warrior king who legitimized conquest. He built an empire through military might and right of conquest, just as the Normans had done. His court represented the ideal of chivalric culture that the Norman aristocracy was trying to establish. He proved that Britain had a glorious past, making it worthy of their rule. For the medieval church, Arthur became a vehicle for exploring the tension between worldly excellence and spiritual perfection. The Grail quest was added as a spiritual dimension, showing that earthly chivalry, no matter how refined, couldn't achieve salvation without divine grace. Arthur's court became an allegory for Christian society, glorious but flawed, striving for perfection but doomed by human weakness. For the Tudors, Arthur was proof of an ancient British sovereignty that predated and transcended Saxon England. Henry VII named his eldest son Arthur, explicitly claiming descent from the ancient British kings and positioning the Tudor dynasty as the fulfillment of the prophecy. Arthur returned to restore British rule. The boy died young and his younger brother became Henry VIII, but the symbolic claim remained important. For the Victorians, drowning in industrialization, colonial administration, and moral anxiety, Arthur represented an idealized medieval past. Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King, 1859–1885, reimagined the legend for Victorian audiences, making Arthur an embodiment of Christian virtue struggling against moral corruption. The pre-Raphaelite painters depicted Arthurian scenes with lush romanticism, creating images of medieval nobility that had nothing to do with historical reality and everything to do with Victorian longing for a simpler, purer world. Tennyson's Arthur explicitly represents Victorian ideals. He's faithful, moral, committed to establishing order and justice. His tragedy isn't just political but personal. He's destroyed by his wife's betrayal and his best friend's treachery. The court falls not because of external enemies but because of internal moral rot. This was the Victorian nightmare. That civilization, no matter how advanced, could be destroyed by moral weakness. For the early 20th century, especially the period around World War I, Arthur became a symbol of lost youth and wasted promise. The flower of British manhood dying in the trenches was implicitly compared to the flower of Arthur's knighthood destroyed at Camelot. T.H. White began writing The Once and Future King, 1938 to 1958, in this context, though he continued through World War II. White's Arthur is explicitly an exploration of political philosophy. His Arthur invents the Round Table not just as a piece of furniture but as an idea, might for right rather than might is right. He tries to civilize the world, to channel human aggression into productive purposes, to create a society based on law and justice rather than violence. And he fails. He fails because human nature can't be changed by institutions alone. His own son Mordred, product of incestuous mistake, becomes the instrument of destruction. The dream dies, but White suggests it was worth dreaming, worth trying, worth failing at. For the feminist retellings of the 1980s and 1990s, Arthur's legend could be deconstructed and rebuilt from female perspectives. Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, 1983, retells the story from the viewpoint of the women, Morgan, Guinevere, the Lady of the Lake, revealing the patriarchal assumptions baked into the traditional narrative. Arthur becomes less central, sometimes even an obstacle. The conflict is between the old goddess religion and the new Christian patriarchy, with Arthur as the weak king caught between. These retellings revealed something important. The traditional legend had marginalized women, making them objects rather than subjects, prizes to be won or temptations to be resisted. By centering them, these new versions showed how much had been missing, how rich the legend could become when half the human experience was finally included. For contemporary fantasy, Arthur is endlessly remixable. He's been a starship captain. John Berman suggested Star Trek's Enterprise as a space-going round table. He's been reincarnated as a modern teenager. He's been a vampire. He's been a woman. He's been black, Asian, queer. Each version explores different aspects of the core themes: leadership, duty, betrayal, redemption, while adapting them to new contexts and new audiences. The legend has become a language, a set of symbols and situations that can be deployed in infinite variations. When you mention Camelot, everyone knows what you mean, not a specific place but an ideal, a brief shining moment of excellence. When you mention a round table, everyone understands, a fellowship of equals, a democratic ideal. When you mention the sword and the stone, everyone grasps the metaphor, the test that reveals true worth, the destiny that chooses you. These have become part of our cultural vocabulary, our shared language of symbols. And this is Arthur's true immortality. Not whether he existed as a historical figure, but the fact that his story has become constitutive of Western culture, shaping how we think about leadership, about heroism, about the tension between ideals and reality. When President Kennedy's administration was retrospectively labeled Camelot after his assassination, the name captured something that pages of analysis couldn't. A brief moment of youth, charisma, promise, and possibility, ended by violence, leaving only the ache of what might have been. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, he was invoking the same hope that the Arthurian legend embodies, that despite setbacks, despite tragedy, despite the failure of individuals and institutions, the dream of a just society persists, worth fighting for even if we won't live to see it fulfilled. When any modern organization creates a round-table discussion, they're invoking Arthur's ideal, a space where hierarchy is suspended, where all voices have equal weight, where truth emerges from dialogue rather than decree. The legend is a mirror, yes, but it's also a lens. It shapes how we see the world. It provides a framework for thinking about perennial human problems. How do we balance competing loyalties? How do we maintain idealism in a corrupt world? How do we respond to betrayal? How do we lead? How do we serve? How do we love? How do we die well? These aren't historical questions. They're existential ones. And the Arthur legend, precisely because it's not tied to verifiable facts, can address them with a freedom that history never could. Part 12, The Eternal Return. So where are we now, here in the 21st century, 16 centuries after a man named Arthur may or may not have fought a battle at a place called Badon? We're still telling Arthur stories. Still arguing about what they mean. Still searching for Camelot in the ruins of Iron Age hill forts. Still debating whether the real Arthur was a king or a cavalry commander, whether he fought in the north or the south, whether he existed at all. The scholarly debate continues with no sign of resolution. Every few years, a new book proposes a new theory, marshalling evidence, arguing passionately for a particular interpretation. Arthur was a Roman cavalry officer named Lucius Artorius Castus stationed in Britain in the 2nd century, and the legend grew around his name. Or he was a northern British king from what's now Scotland, and the battles Nennius lists took place in the north, not the south. Or he was a composite of multiple leaders whose separate achievements were later attributed to a single hero. Or the whole legend sprang from mythological roots. An old god euhemerized, made human, then given a historical setting by later writers who'd forgotten his divine origins. Each theory has its evidence, its logic, its passionate defenders. Academic conferences are held. Papers are published. Excavations are mounted, seeking the definitive proof that will settle the question. And the question remains unsettled, perhaps unsettleable. The silence of the contemporary sources ensures we'll never know with certainty. We'll never find an inscription that says, "Here lies Arthur, victor of Badon, dux bellorum of the Britons." We'll never excavate a grave that yields his sword and crown. We'll never discover a cache of letters discussing his campaigns. The evidence simply doesn't exist, or if it once existed, it was lost in the chaos of sub-Roman Britain, when cities emptied, literacy collapsed, and the mechanisms of record-keeping disappeared. And yet, does it matter? The historical Arthur, if he existed, was probably unremarkable in most ways. A middle-aged warrior in weathered armor, scarred from battles, dealing with logistics and politics and 1,000 mundane details that war requires. A man who shouted orders, made hard decisions, sent men to their deaths, and tried to keep a fragile coalition of fractious British kings working together long enough to mount an effective defense. He might have been brilliant. He might have been lucky. He might have been in the right place at the right time with just enough competence to not screw up. We'll never know. That man, that historical reality, is lost to us. And maybe that's as it should be. Because what we have instead is something richer, more complex, more useful. We have the legend of Arthur, the once and future king. The king who tried to bring justice to a broken world. The leader who gathered the best knights he could find and tried to create a fellowship dedicated to protecting the weak and establishing right. The man who built something beautiful knowing it was doomed, who fought for ideals even when those ideals proved impossible to sustain, whose court fell not because the dream was wrong but because humans are flawed. We have the story of Lancelot, torn between love and loyalty, destroyed by his inability to choose, the greatest knight in the world brought low by human weakness. We have Guinevere, trapped in a political marriage, finding love in the wrong place, her choices constrained by a patriarchal system that treated women as property. We have Mordred, the Shadow Son, product of Arthur's youthful mistake, representing the sins of the past that return to destroy the present. We have Merlin, the wise counselor who can see the future but cannot prevent the tragedy he knows is coming. We have Galahad, the pure knight who achieves spiritual perfection and promptly dies, unable to exist in an imperfect world. We have Gawain, loyal beyond reason, whose love for his brothers drives him to destroy his dearest friend. We have the Grail, the impossible object, the spiritual quest that reveals the hollowness of worldly achievement. We have Camelot, the shining city that never was, the brief moment of excellence, the ideal that failed but whose failure somehow mattered more than most successes. These aren't historical figures. They're archetypes, symbols, lenses through which we examine perennial human struggles. They're tools for thinking, for feeling, for understanding our own experiences. And we have the promise, embedded in Geoffrey of Monmouth's ambiguous ending, elaborated in centuries of folklore, stated explicitly in the inscription on Arthur's supposed grave at Glastonbury, that Arthur isn't dead. He's sleeping. He's waiting. He'll return when Britain, or by extension when any nation, any society, needs him most. This is the myth of the Rex Quandam Rexque Futurus, the once and future king, in its purest, most powerful form. It's found across Europe in different versions. The German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sleeps under the Kyffhauser mountain, his beard growing through the stone table before him, waiting to wake when Germany needs him. The Serbian Prince Marko rests beneath a mountain, his sword gradually cutting through the stone, ready to emerge when his people face their darkest hour. Even Holger Dansk of Denmark and Finn MacCool of Ireland have similar legends. But Arthur's version is the most famous, the most enduring because his story was recorded by literate monks and poets, because it escaped the confines of oral tradition and entered the mainstream of Western literature, because it was elaborated by the best writers of multiple centuries, because it spoke to something deep and universal. The promise isn't literal. No one truly expects a 6th-century warlord to rise from a cave and save Britain from whatever contemporary crisis it faces. The promise is metaphorical, psychological, cultural. It says, heroism is not dead. The dream of justice survives. When things are darkest, when civilization seems lost, when all seems hopeless, that's when the hero returns. Not literally but spiritually. Not as an individual but as an idea, an inspiration, a reminder of what's possible. Arthur returns whenever someone decides to fight for justice despite the odds. He returns whenever a leader tries to create a fellowship of equals. He returns whenever someone reaches for an ideal even knowing they'll fail. He returns whenever the story is retold, reread, remembered. The once and future king is always returning because we need him to return. We need to believe that heroism is possible, that idealism matters, that the fight is worth fighting even if we lose. This is the legend's true meaning, its real power. Not as history but as hope. Not as fact but as faith. Faith that the best of human nature, courage, compassion, justice, excellence, can triumph however briefly over the worst. Faith that the dream of Camelot, though it always fails, is worth dreaming. Faith that somewhere in the mists the king sleeps and the sword waits and the story continues. Conclusion: the king in the mountain. Here, as this long night's journey approaches its end, let's return to where we began, with a monk in the British Museum, writing a question in the margins of a manuscript. Rex Arthurus, Anfiut? Did King Arthur exist? We've traveled 16 centuries trying to answer that question. We've examined every scrap of evidence, every theory, every legend. We've seen how a possible historical figure, a war leader fighting desperate battles in the twilight of Roman Britain, was transformed through oral tradition into a Welsh hero, then through Geoffrey of Monmouth into a conquering king, then through Chrétien de Troyes into a tragic figure presiding over a court of love and adventure, then through Cistercian monks into the centerpiece of a vast theological drama about sin and redemption. We've seen how each age reshaped Arthur to serve its needs, how the legend became a mirror reflecting each era's dreams and anxieties. We've seen how impossible it is to extract historical truth from mythological accretion, how thoroughly the possible facts have been buried under layers of poetry and politics and wish fulfillment. And we've arrived, perhaps, at this understanding. The question of Arthur's historical existence, while fascinating, is ultimately beside the point. What matters is that for 1500 years the story has endured. It has shaped literature, inspired art, influenced politics, provided a language of symbols that Western culture still uses. It has given us ways to think about leadership and loyalty, about love and betrayal, about the tension between ideals and reality, about the inevitability of failure and the necessity of trying anyway. The legend teaches us that heroes don't have to be perfect. Arthur makes terrible mistakes. His affair with his half-sister that produces Mordred, his failure to see the growing tensions in his court, his inability to reconcile the demands of justice with the claims of love. Lancelot is an adulterer. Guinevere is guilty of treason. Gawain's loyalty becomes destructive vengeance. These flaws don't diminish the heroes, they make them human. They make the tragedy meaningful. If Arthur's court had been perfect, its fall would have been simple bad luck or malevolent fate. But because the court was flawed from within, because the heroes themselves carried the seeds of destruction, the tragedy becomes about human nature itself. It becomes about us. The legend teaches us that idealism is dangerous and necessary. Arthur's attempt to create a kingdom of justice, to channel might for right, is doomed to fail. Human nature won't cooperate. People will betray, will choose personal desire over collective good, will rationalize their failures and compound their mistakes. The round table will shatter. Camelot will fall. And yet the attempt matters. The dream of a just society, even knowing it will fail, is worth pursuing. The fellowship, however temporary, is worth creating. The ideals, however impossible to fully realize, are worth fighting for. This is not naive optimism. The legend knows it's tragic. The ending is always Camelot, always betrayal and death and ruin. But the legend insists the tragedy is meaningful, that the struggle itself, the attempt to build something better, has value independent of the outcome. The legend teaches us about the power of story itself. Whatever historical truth might lie at the origin of the Arthur legend has been completely obscured. We'll never recover it with certainty. But that historical truth, one battle, one leader, one moment of resistance, has become something infinitely larger through the alchemy of storytelling. The legend has outlived empires. It has survived the collapse of the civilization that created it. It has adapted to completely different cultural contexts, different languages, different media. It has proven more durable than stone, more lasting than bronze, more influential than most political achievements. This is the power of story. Not to record what happened but to make meaning from what happened. Not to preserve facts but to preserve truths, human truths about courage and fear, love and hate, ambition and resignation, hope and despair. And the legend teaches us, finally, about the necessity of hope. The myth of the sleeping king, waiting to return in Britain's darkest hour, is a powerful statement of faith. Not religious faith necessarily but cultural faith, faith in the possibility of renewal, faith that the light can return after the darkness. Every age needs this faith. Every society faces its Camelot, its moment of crisis when all seems lost. The promise that Arthur might return, that heroism might resurge, that justice might prevail, that the ideal might be attempted again, is what allows cultures to survive their darkest moments. We tell the story again because we need to remember that failure isn't final. That institutions fall but ideals survive. That heroes die but heroism persists. That Camelot is always falling but it's always being rebuilt somewhere by someone in some form. Now as you drift towards sleep, let yourself dream of that shining court, that fellowship of equals, that brief moment when justice seemed possible. Let yourself feel the ache of its loss and the hope of its return. Let yourself believe, if only in the twilight between waking and sleeping, that somewhere a sword rests in stone, waiting for the right hand. That somewhere a king sleeps beneath a mountain, gathering strength. That somewhere the story continues as it has for 1500 years, as it will as long as humans tell stories and dream of justice. Did King Arthur exist? Perhaps that anonymous monk who scrawled the question in the margins of a manuscript knew, even as he wrote it, that the question couldn't be definitively answered. Perhaps he was asking not for a factual answer but a philosophical one. Does Arthur exist in the way that matters most? In the collective imagination, in the cultural memory, in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we might become? To that question the answer is unambiguous. Yes. Yes, Arthur exists. He exists in every tale of a leader who tried to do right. In every fellowship that strives for justice. In every individual who reaches for an ideal knowing they might fail. In every story that insists meaning can be made from chaos, that heroism is possible, that the fight is worth fighting. Arthur exists wherever his story is told. And tonight, here, together, scattered across the globe but gathered in the darkness, you listening, me speaking, we've told his story once again. We've kept the faith. We've remembered the king. And in remembering, we've ensured that somewhere in the mists between sleeping and waking, between history and myth, between what was and what might yet be, Arthur still rides. The sword still gleams. The banner still flies. The quest continues. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the mists of Britain's past. I hope you found something of value here, some new way of thinking about this ancient, eternal story. If you did, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe for more explorations of history's deepest mysteries. As sleep takes you, may you dream of Camelot, not as a lost past but as a possible future. Not as a place but as a promise. Not as history but as hope. The sword is in the stone, waiting for the right hand. The king sleeps in his mountain, waiting for the darkest hour. The story continues, waiting for the next teller. Perhaps that teller is you. Perhaps tomorrow when you wake, you'll carry something of Arthur's dream with you into the waking world. Perhaps you'll try in whatever way you can, to build a little piece of Camelot in your corner of the world. Perhaps you'll reach for an ideal knowing you might fail, but knowing also that the reaching matters. That would make you a knight of the Round Table, though the table is invisible and the fellowship scattered across time and space. That would make Arthur's story true in the only way that ultimately matters, not historically but eternally. Good night, fellow seeker in the darkness. May your dreams be filled with quests worth taking, fellowships worth joining, and ideals worth failing at. The once and future king sleeps. But the story never sleeps. It's here with us, now and always, until the last human voice falls silent and the last story is told. And perhaps not even then. Perhaps even in whatever comes after, in whatever form human consciousness takes, the story of Arthur will persist. The tale of the king who tried, who failed, who waits, who returns. Rex Arthurus, and Fute? Was there a King Arthur? Yes, and no, and always, and never. He lives in the space between those answers, in the mist between certainty and doubt, in the eternal twilight between history and myth. And there he'll remain, the once and future king, sleeping and waking, dying and returning, as long as humans need heroes and hope and the dream of something better. Good night.